Alrighty. So, real quick, I am going to finish the notes over Unit 9 because yesterday I accidentally, uh, started a real meeting in the middle of lecturing. So, all right. So, we were talking about different solutions to either mitigating, which means like lessening the impact of, right, climate change, or adapting to climate change. So, oh, whoops. Okay. So, mitigation is mainly trying to take the impact that we're having on the environment and trying to mitigate it, to slow it down, to lessen it, to stop impacting it, right? So, there are a lot of things on Earth that are really good carbon sinks. So, the bottom of the ocean is a carbon sink because as organisms die and they float to the bottom of the ocean, that carbon isn't really a part of any ecosystem, right? Because once you get outside the photic zone, you really don't have like anything consuming that carbon and releasing it into the environment, right? And then those things can actually be like detritus, right? The marine snow we talked about during our aquatics unit can be covered by like essentially landslides on the bottom of the ocean as the tectonic plates shift, and it's on its way to be made into a fossil fuel. That is where like deep sea drilling like gets the organic material to have oil in the first place. But it's important to keep in mind that that process takes millions of years. Okay. Another example is forests, because when plants inhale carbon dioxide and exhale O2, they have sequestered carbon. They've taken carbon and they've stored it as a food source for later. And they store that mostly in their roots, right? But also, their trunks are made of like carbon chains. Okay. So like the matter that makes up a tree is mostly carbon, so it's being stored and used, right? And it is no longer a part of the atmosphere. Also, there's a misnomer, right, that all like 60% of the world's oxygen is created by the Amazon rainforest. The answer to that is more complicated. It's kind of true, right? But it turns out on average, the Amazon rainforest absorbs about as much carbon dioxide as is put out by the Amazon rainforest, right? Because it has living organisms in it and they are exhaling carbon dioxide. So that's a wash, right? But what happens is because of the like decaying matter on the floor of the rainforest, all the dead leaves decomposing, when it rains, that flows into the Amazon River. And that waste material is high in nitrogen, right? And it's high in phosphorus, which are two things that algae really like. And so where that fresh water meets the ocean, there's like a permanent like algae plankton pool, right? And the algae in that pool do a lot of photosynthesis. And as a result, they are fixing carbon themselves. And so we could deliberately fertilize them in order to increase the rate at which they are consuming CO2 and producing oxygen. However, we know that that is not good for everything in that ecosystem. And so that in particular is one of those things where you look at it and we know about the massive fish kills that take place in the Gulf of Mexico every year because of the agricultural runoff from the Mississippi. And you don't want to make that problem worse. Sometimes it's been known to happen that a human will be trying to fix a problem and they will accidentally make the problem worse. We've talked about cane toads in Australia, and that's an example of that. Okay, another change we can make to mitigate our impact that we're having on the ecosystem is to stop doing the things that release the carbon in the first place. So one option is to take the carbon out of the atmosphere. The other option is to stop putting it there, right? So switching from fossil fuels to more renewable energy sources. Looking at like wind and solar, we've talked about those in detail. You know that each one of those things does have their own consequences, right? Um, Cows produce a ton of methane, right? Mainly because they're fed badly. I think we talked about this during the unit where we talked about Shust in West Texas. Yeah, gross, right? But um, so cows usually produce so much methane because they're ruminants. They are supposed to eat grass, and it sits in the first stomach and gets partially digested, second stomach, third stomach, fourth stomach. Really, one of those stomachs is their esophagus. But long story short, they're supposed to eat things that are high in cellulose, and that's why they have four stomachs, is for it to take a long time to break down that cellulose. You, for example, cannot break down cellulose. So you have not enough room and not enough time in your stomach for it to be good for you, right? Okay, so usually though, we don't let cows just graze. Instead, what we do is we feed them corn. Well, corn is different than grass in a variety of ways. Not just they don't look the same, right? Corn is high in sugar, and sugars are simple and easy to be digested and dissolved in stomach acid, right? And so as a result, cows are sitting there and they're digesting this cornmeal that they're being fed because we don't have the time to let them, and the resources and the land to let them graze, that it's sitting and it's like, what's a good word for it? It's like it's fermenting in their stomach and releasing gases. That is why you hear about cows like, oh, cows produce a ton of methane by like belching and farting. And that's why, is because we feed them so badly, they have permanent indigestion, right? So eating less beef would be a serious way to impact the emissions, some of the emissions from the meat industry, which we talked about. Oh gosh, I think it was Unit 5. And then finding alternatives to ammonium fertilizer, which can be converted by like microbes in the soil into nitric oxides. And remember that nitric oxides are actually a much better greenhouse gas than CO2. So they are much better at trapping heat, and they contribute more to the problem per molecule released. Okay. Another thing to consider is geoengineering, right? So artificially changing what normally would happen on the earth, okay? So an example of this would be to make large spaces reflective. As we lose snow cover, the albedo of the earth gets lower and it absorbs heat instead of reflecting it back into space. If we were to cover large swaths of land with a reflective or light surface, it would be unbearable and no one could live there, but it would reflect a lot of the heat back up into the atmosphere. The problem is that would also probably damage the ecosystem underneath it. Also, people have talked about taking aerosols and releasing them into the stratosphere so that they would reflect light. We'd be trying to, I don't know if you remember on the first slide, here I can pull it up. Slide 6, right? 5% of the light that comes from the sun is directly reflected back into the atmosphere, or back into space by the atmosphere. It just bounces right off. And with that geoengineering push, what you're trying to do is you're trying to increase that percentage. Although I personally doubt that we currently have the technology and the, let's call it the follow through, to make a large scale geoengineering mission work, right? Like, I don't believe in humanity's ability to build something and then do the proper maintenance. Look at our infrastructure, our roads, our schools, right? We don't really keep them up. And I think that's a lot more dangerous when you're controlling the temperature of the earth by releasing stuff into the atmosphere. I think that can get dangerous really fast, too hot or too cold. The third option is something we actually already do. So it's carbon capture and storage. When there is a point source of carbon pollution, so not everyone's cars, That's a non-point source because it's a bunch of different cars contributing to one problem, right? A point source is like there's a smokestack at this factory and it is putting a ton of CO2 into the atmosphere. We talked about carbon scrubbers before, but taking that and then sequestering that carbon, burying it underground, done. We actually currently do that one. And I think it's much more manageable because it's on a like factory by factory basis. All right. Another option to mitigate the things caused by climate change is a carbon cap, right? So that means that a single facility can only release a certain amount of carbon dioxide. And then if you had like leftover carbon dioxide in your budget, right, you could trade it to other factories so that they could pollute more, but they would have to give you something, pay you something, right? And so it would create like a financial incentive for corporations to be under the limit, because if they are under the limit, they could sell that limit to another factory that needs it, right? However, this bill did not pass. It was defeated in the Senate because it was supposed, I mean, it would. There's no way around this. It would increase the cost per kilowatt hour of electricity, and it would probably increase the cost of consumer goods. Yeah, but I would say there's an asterisk to that. Humans are pretty good at cutting costs. When something costs a certain amount, people will invent better and better and better ways to make it or manufacture it or produce it to save costs in the long run. They're going to do that whether there's a cap and trade or not. They want to make the biggest profit margin. And so while I do think it would initially raise prices, I think that eventually it would not. Because if companies knew that they had to meet this requirement and did meet this requirement, they would figure out a way to make it cheaper really fast. Under the Obama administration, the EPA began publishing restrictions on carbon pollutants. However, these restrictions basically don't exist anymore. I will leave this tweets up for a second for your viewing pleasure. You've heard me talk about this before in class. I don't think anti-science rhetoric helps anyone. I don't think not acknowledging the truth helps anyone, and I don't think building a system that ignores the consequences of our action helps anyone. It just kicks the problem down the road a bit. And that's how I feel about that. All right. It's actually kind of funny. So this is something I think is hilarious. Many local governments are already having to spend money to combat the problems associated with climate change in their community. So building seawalls, putting erosion barriers on beaches, raising roadways, and installing stormwater pumps that will pump the salt water from a storm surge out of the town, right? And this is funny because the Florida government has to spend all this money doing this, but they don't believe in climate change. So they're sitting here and they're like, God, we got to spend $2 million on pumps this year. Who could know why this happens to us? And 97% of the scientific community is like, actually, I do know why this is happening to you. And they're like, why is this happening to me? There's no reason. It's kind of funny, right? Also, I would like to say, as somebody who was in the military, right, the military has been preparing for the eventualities of climate change impacting the way we have to fight wars for about a decade. Yeah. Everything from the type of technology we're going to need to where we're going to be fighting wars. We've been preparing for that for a long time. So it's kind of funny because right now the official national stance is that this is not a problem and this is not a thing. And it's funny because the military is like, yeah, it's not a thing, but if it were a thing, we would have to, seriously consider whether or not we need people to know how to speak Russian. Who could say why we need that? So I think that's kind of funny. Um, yeah, in 2011, the Florida governor instituted a written ban on the use of the word climate change at all state level communication. And I think that this is a story we've heard before in this class, right? Hopefully, you are sitting here like, this sounds kind of like the thing with unleaded gasoline, where the tetraethyl lead companies had a vested interest in keeping tetraethyl lead as an additive in gasoline, and they fought it tooth and nail, and eventually they lost. Or the same thing you see with cigarettes, right? In the 1950s, literally, cigarette companies were like, you can't prove that cigarettes cause cancer because find someone who doesn't smoke to do a double-blind study. Bet you can't, right? And they couldn't because everyone smoked and it was invigorating for the lungs, you know? And so we've seen this before, and it's funny to me that that we haven't learned that you can't just fight the truth. You can't. It doesn't end up working for you in the long run. So this is similar to the tragedy of the commons, right? So we talked about, like, when we talked about the tragedy of the commons, one of the big examples is like the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, right? And how yeah, nobody owns the ocean, so who's going to clean it up? Who's going to stop dumping stuff in it? Who's going to stop somebody who's dumping stuff in it? Nobody, right? Nobody's responsible, so nobody wants to spend money on it. And you look at the same thing with our atmosphere. Who owns air? No one, right? And so nobody feels responsible for it. And nobody feels like it's their job to clean it up, because cleaning it up is expensive. There's no way around that. Cleaning it up is expensive. And so who's going to take responsibility for it? Well, at this point, the answer is absolutely no one. It's not a problem. And we'll just see where that leads us. Okay, so I've linked some really some interesting videos. Just reinforcing topics that we've had earlier this year. You guys have access to my PowerPoint, so you can click on these. The Trouble with Tumbles is really good. It's about how tumbleweeds are an invasive species. It's hilarious, and it's by CPG Gray. I did put that invasive strategies are generally R strategists and generalists and outcompete the local species that have a more narrow niche because they're specialized and sometimes tend to be K strategists. Chinese carp, I think this is funny because they're literally building a wall to the Great Lakes that electrocutes fish. It's amazing. You have to see it. And then cane toads, but like too much. There's a nursery rhyme. There was an old woman who swallowed a fly. I don't know why she swallowed the fly. I'll guess she'll die. And then she swallows a mouse to catch the fly. And then she swallows a cat to catch the mouse. And then she swallows a dog to catch the cat. And it's a thing, right? So cane toads, that's what happened. And they're poisonous. So like none of the local species can eat them. And you should watch that. I think it's funny. Also, I wanted to talk about the difference between like an endangered species, because endangered species are usually endangered because they have like massive habitat loss. Like humans have just come in and built stuff where they live. I particularly want to talk about pandas because I think that they're a good case study, right? So pandas are lazy, right? And females are fertile for like 48 hours out of every 3 months, right? And they'll only go find somebody to mate with if there is literally no obstacle in their way. And so what happened in rural China is they started building roads. And what that caused is called habitat fragmentation. And so then there'd be like a panda and then a road and then another panda, and they won't cross it. They won't do it. Lazy. And so it's not like there isn't any habitat. A road doesn't take up a whole habitat, but also like the noise from a road will stress them out and they won't do what they need to do, right? Or they won't eat or they won't whatever, right? It interferes with them just enough. And they were a specialist species. Like they are the definition of a specialist species. And so humans have spent an inordinate amount of time trying to get pandas to, produce offspring. And we've been hitherto mildly successful. I will say, when a species becomes endangered, you lose a lot of the genetic diversity that was like present in the native population, right? And so as a result, like, even if you could breed them back up to the original population size, it is the same number of individuals, but it is way less genetic diversity between them. They're inbred, right? And I am not going to explain to you why that's a bad thing, because I know I've done it before in class, and this is going on the internet. It also can cause extinction of mutualistic species. Their predators are, not safe because they have nothing to eat now. And then it stimulates the economy in a bad way, where it goes, oh, there's no more pandas left, I must have one, right? When they only make like 10 of a watch, and then each watch goes for $500,000, that's kind of the thing that happens with pandas. Oh, I want to have a panda, or I want to have a panda fur rug, or I want to have panda organs to increase my stamina or whatever, right? So these are just some reminders from earlier, but when you look at how interconnected ecosystems are, you're looking at the competition between species, intra and interspecies competition. You're looking at the specialized niche that each species fills in its ecosystem. You have generalists and specialists. Generalists are good at a bunch of jobs, but they don't do any of them perfectly. A specialist does one job perfectly, but they can't do anything else. So they are more susceptible to being taken over by an invasive species. Behavioral fitness is how well adapted your bloodline is to survive. So that goes right along with survival of the fittest. Birds that are better at migrating accurately are more likely to have offspring, and then their offspring will inherit the gene for that migration tool, right? So humans are like, no stars, would not purchase again. They poach, destroy habitats, and sometimes just accidentally break the planet. It's cool, it's fine, right? There are things we can do, though. That's kind of the point of this one, though, is like, there are options we can take, but none of them are free. All of them cost money. But the other option is maybe just no humans, right? We talked about how the Earth has been hotter than this before, and it has been colder than this before, but not with humans on it. And so, cool. All right, so human impacts on biodiversity. We do a couple of things, that aren't the best. One thing we do is when we install agriculture in an area, we also tend to create monocultures, right? So instead of all of the prairie grass that used to live where my neighborhood is right now, this is a St. Augustine community. We all have the same grass, right? And it's all, looks the same, it all acts the same. And as a result, that's what we call a monoculture. We have decreased the species richness in our community. And a really good example of that is the potato famine. And I'm sure I've talked about this before in class, but I honestly can't remember if I have. So here's the skinny, right? The potato blight came to Ireland, and because they were only growing essentially russet potatoes, everyone's potatoes got it. There was no genetic diversity, so there was no chance of being immune, right? So we've talked about this before. Sometimes your genetics just make you immune to something, like sickle cell. If you are heterozygous, meaning you carry sickle cell, but you don't have sickle cell, it is much harder to get malaria. That's awesome, right? And so the same thing happens when you have a monoculture of potatoes. If you have a monoculture of potatoes and a famine, a blight comes in, right, like a mold that kills all your potatoes, there's no chance that you're just going to be immune if it's all genetically identical, okay? We also sometimes break habitats. We sometimes pull out an entire level of the food chain because it's a snack for us, and then the ecosystem can collapse, or we can destroy a particular niche, which will cause a species to go extinct. We also bring in invasive species, which are natural monocultures. And let's be very clear, invasive species are fine when they live in where they're supposed to live, right? Because they have a natural predator in that environment. Something keeps them in check in that environment. But when you take them and you put them somewhere else, they just take over because they're generalists. They're just going to fill every niche. And their ecosystem back home was balanced for that. Okay, it was specifically like everything came around together. They worked in synchrony. And we take that away when we put them in a different environment. We also pollute. Sad face. We, change the global climate, and we overexploit things when it comes to like poaching. And all of those are things that, humans do that can have a negative impact on the environment. Just a reminder from Unit 2, when we talk about why biodiversity matters, imagine that you were playing Red Rover and somebody is running at you and you have your hands clasped and they break through, right? That's because you only had one arm in their way. But let's say you instead stacked a bunch of people, like you made a giant crowd of people and you all like linked your hands like a web across the center. And then the Red Rover had to run through the middle of that. Way less likely to get through, right? When you have biodiversity, if you damage one part of the food web, the other parts can still support it, right? It's like taking a brick out of the facade of your house, right? Well, you could take as many bricks as you wanted because I'm pretty sure the facade of this house is just like glued onto the outside of the beams, right? It's not attached seriously. And so a couple of things on my house could be damaged. But if you start taking beams out, because all of a sudden you've taken away all the extra stuff in my house and it's just the beams that hold up the roof, and you start taking beams out because there's not biodiversity, there's not other stuff in the ecosystem, it will collapse. Okay, so I was going to talk about gut biodiversity as a microcosm. I'm actually basically going to skip this. I was just going to talk about how you have like a delicate balance in your own intestines. You have a microbiome in your own intestines, and you have multiple types of bacteria that thrive based on whether you eat a lot of protein, eat a lot of fiber, or eat a lot of sugar, or eat a lot of fat. There's 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. There's 5. Just kidding. Okay. So, they help you when they're balanced. However, let's say you go on like a bender and you eat nothing but Twizzlers for like a week. Well, you're going to kill the bacteria that eat protein and the bacteria that eat fat and the bacteria that eat fiber, and you're only going to be left with sugar bacteria. And so those bacteria are going to send your gut a signal that says, hey, we need some more sugar, right? Because that's what they know how to eat, and they're the only ones left. So that biodiversity, having all 5 of those bacteria originally, provided stability to your microbiome. I was going to go into more detail. We were going to do a thing, but digital learning. Okay. This is a picture of habitat fragmentation. Basically, if there are interior species, they can no longer live. And then I put a picture of it. You can see where the clusters of trees have been broken up by farmland. And like, that's fine and all, except for the fact that, let's say that usually you would have like a colony or 2 or 3 species within like the interior habitat. Now it's so small, it can only support 1 or 2 or just 1, right? And it can support way more edge species. So you've changed the species richness. The species is less, like the number of species is smaller. Even if you have the same total number of animals, you've decreased the biodiversity. This just shows like domesticated crops and how many variants of them there are. You'll see that we tend to drive towards one good product, right? So instead of having 50 types of rice, we're going to have 3, right? Instead of having 200 types of cows, we're going to have 4, right? And so as a result, like we're decreasing the species diversity, and we're decreasing the genetic diversity within each species by deliberately breeding for the traits that we want. And we've done so to the point where some species can no longer reproduce in the wild. I know I've mentioned this before, but because we like turkeys to have a lot of white meat, we have bred them to have such big breastbones, like your sternum, but like a bird, so it's curved, that they actually cannot naturally have sex. We have to artificially inseminate them because we have bred them into such a grotesque monstrosity version of their original selves that they cannot reproduce. Same thing's true. I have an English bulldog. She is outside right now, I think lying in the sun. But she cannot have children. I mean, she can't because she's spayed, right? But before that, she would have had to have a C-section because we have bred them to have such narrow hips that she can't naturally have babies. Okay, and so when you select for some traits, you're selecting against others. All right, so best practices. We've talked a lot about sustainable land use. We talked about how you can do different types of contour plowing, crop rotation, planting multiple crops side by side, all of those things from your land use chapter, right? We can also work to restore lost habitats. The coal mine that's paying for me to go to coal camp this summer, they want me to see that their coal mine, they've replanted it and there's a forest now, right? Now that they're done with that particular mine. And so they're making an argument that they are replacing the ecosystem as they're destroying it. I am interested to see if that's true. And then habitat corridors. So that's actually what the picture in the like bottom left-hand corner of the slide is. Imagine that we put like options for animals to not cross the road, right? Now, some of them are idiots. There are still going to be deer in the road, right? Y'all are from Morgan's Point. You know what I'm talking about. But if we could just provide an option, maybe they wouldn't go out on the asphalt and get hit by a car. And then maybe their habitat would not be fragmented. They could still migrate. So that's it. That's all of Unit 9. So I look forward to seeing you guys on the Zoom classroom today and hearing your questions. If you have any questions about this that like can't wait, please feel free to just email me. Okay, I'll be sitting by my computer all day. All right, bye guys.